It all began with man's obsession to emulate the birds, to fly. And naively, yet bravely, through early history, he thought it was simply a matter of building himself a big enough pair of wings, flapping them furiously, and leaping off some high point. Alas, despite scores of recorded attempts over the centuries, none ever succeeded. The hard fact was, and still is, that even with the most sophisticated apparatus strapped to his body, man is just not strong enough. To be a bird, he would require a 6-foot chest to hold all the muscles he would need to fly, even if he had wings. Another school of thought was convinced that kites could be made to lift man off Mother Earth. The world's first production models are known to have been in service in the Orient back in the Middle Ages. Some made swaying ascents of hundreds of feet. Some died on the flight deck. It wasn't until the 18th century that man succeeded in overcoming gravity in sustained fashion. He did it with a hot air balloon, and it happened in Paris in 1783. The balloon, which carried a sheep, a cockerel, and a duck, was the invention of the French brothers Montgolfier, and the world's first pilot was a gentleman called Pilote de Rosier. Later, together with a French nobleman, the Marquis d'Arlande, he made the first aerial voyage in history, crossing Paris in a 25-minute flight. But man was still obsessed with emulating the birds, with winged flight. And in the early 19th century, a young Yorkshire baronet, Sir George Cayley, achieved it. He discovered the forces acting on a wing in flight and built several gliders. One of them actually became airborne for a few yards off a Yorkshire hillside carrying a boy. But the fixed-wing flying machine still lacked an effective means of propulsion, efficient lightweight motors, and methods of control to steer in 3 dimensions. The development at the end of the 19th century of the petrol internal combustion engine solved the first problem. 2 bicycle makers at Dayton, Ohio, solved the second. They were the brothers Wilbur and Orville Wright. Together, they built a small 12-horsepower engine and fitted it to a flimsy biplane called the Flyer. It had 2 propellers, elevators in front, a rudder at the back, and it banked by twisting the wingtips. Wing warping, it was called. In December 1903, Orville Wright flew it at Kitty Hawk in North Carolina, an historic 120 feet, becoming in 12 seconds the first man to achieve sustained, controlled, powered flight in a heavier-than-air machine. Orville Wright's first flight was not filmed. In this newsreel, shot in later trials at Kitty Hawk, the aircraft had proved reliable enough to carry passengers. The Wright brothers' triumph triggered a spate of feverish activity in the development of powered flight. Some were conspicuously successful. This one, built by Frenchman Louis Blériot, flew the Channel. Some had difficulty getting airborne at all. But all in all, it was the golden age of aviation. In 1919, converted bombers became the world's first airliners. Early passengers flew in tiny cabins built into the fuselage. The pilots sat in open cockpits, braving the slipstream. But soon, purpose-built airliners were coming into service. By the late 20s, airline routes were beginning to span the world. Fabric-covered biplanes were giving way to luxurious flying boats. and to all-metal land planes carrying 30 passengers. The modern airliner had arrived. Once again, in the aftermath of war, civil aviation got back on its feet with hastily converted military aircraft. Sunderland flying boats became Hythes and Solents, and the illustrious Lancaster emerged as the Lancastrian, taking 3 days to carry passengers from London to Sydney. Then along came new purpose-built airliners. And with them, the jets. The early 1970s saw dramatic new shapes in the skies, the wide-bodied jumbos expanding the age of mass air travel. But although aircraft grew bigger, they didn't fly much faster than 600 miles an hour. Until January the 21st, 1976. On that day, the world's first supersonic passenger services began. A new, slender Delta shape became airborne to advance international flight in one single step, from the 10 miles a minute of the subsonic jets to 23 miles a minute, twice the speed of sound. Concorde. But supersonic flight did not arrive overnight. The sound barrier of popular fame was a reality. Toward the end of the Second World War, the most advanced propeller aircraft, which could attain 9/10ths of the speed of sound in a dive, were experiencing an effect called compressibility. What was happening was that at the approach to the speed of sound, about 760 miles an hour at sea level, the air ahead of the aircraft was becoming compressed and starting to create shock waves, which raised the drag to levels the engines could not overcome. Below Mach 1, sound pulses from the aircraft move ahead and warn the molecules of air, which rearrange themselves to give the aircraft a relatively unimpeded passage. But as the aircraft approaches the speed of sound, the pulses can't get ahead. Early attempts to conquer the drag barrier used rocket motors, and it was in the Bell X-1 rocket ship in 1947 that an American Air Force captain, Chuck Yeager, became the first pilot to exceed Mach 1. Launched from a B-29, he achieved, to be precise, just Mach 1.015. But to fly smoothly in sustained supersonic level flight, adequate thrust, which the jet engine now provided, was not enough. Aircraft design had to change. Wings, which were already beginning to be swept back, were made thinner. Fuselages were more finely streamlined. And on some aircraft, needle-sharp noses were introduced. The nose was now able to make physical contact with the shock wave, which ceased to be a barrier to the aircraft's progress. The shock wave, in fact, began to travel with the aircraft at its speed beyond Mach 1. The swept-wing Super Sabre was the first jet fighter capable of exceeding the speed of sound without diving. It was the first of a generation of level-flight supersonic military aircraft. With the sound barrier behind them, military aircraft designers were to meet a new problem: the heat barrier. At supersonic speeds, friction between the aircraft's surface and the molecules of air in contact with it causes the skin to heat up. Although the temperature rise rearwards from the nose is illustrated in colour here, in fact the heat effect is never visible. So for flight much above Mach 2, tougher metals like titanium and stainless steel had to be used. In 1967, a rocket-powered steel aircraft, the American X-15, recorded skin temperatures of over 1,300 degrees Fahrenheit, while making the highest speed yet achieved by man outside of a spacecraft. The X-15 reached the incredible speed of 4,534 miles an hour. But it was one thing to build hypersonic battleships flown by specialist one- and two-man crews. It was quite another to build a faster-than-sound airliner that could carry 100 or more passengers in a conventional cabin, like this, in total safety and comfort along the air routes of the world, cruising supersonically, yet able to operate subsonically through the traffic patterns of busy international airports. But that is the achievement of Concorde. How was it done? Well, first, by designing a very remarkable wing of slender delta shape. A wing sculptured like a leaf, with precisely calculated camber, taper, droop and twist. A wing created by aerodynamicists for efficiency in supersonic flight, and for landing at 185 miles an hour. It grew from the simplicity of a dart, evolving into shapes more slender, complex, beautiful, and aerodynamically effective. A wing which, when flown at high angles of incidence, that is, at high nose-up attitudes, as on takeoff and on the approach to land, generates a vortex in the air flowing along both edges. The higher the nose-up attitude, up to certain limits, the greater the vortex effect. The vortices produce powerful suction lifting forces on the upper surfaces of the wing, so much so that it will not stall, and the wing needs none of the extra lift and braking devices found in the big subsonic jets. Concorde's high nose-up attitude on landing and takeoff could have created a problem for the pilots. Their forward visibility, immediately ahead and below, would have been badly restricted. So Concorde was given a droop nose, which can be lowered to 5 degrees for taxiing and takeoff, and to 12.5 degrees for approach and landing. On the flight deck, up there, the pilots at touchdown are sitting about 35 feet above the runway. The decision to make Concorde a Mach 2 airliner meant that it could be built almost entirely in aluminium alloy, a metal unlike steel and titanium, of which the aircraft industry had vast knowledge. From years of exhaustive testing, the aircraft was built to take big temperature ranges in its stride, allowing crew and passengers to travel in normal airline comfort. They're protected behind this scratch panel by 2 sheets of heat-resistant glass, and between the 2 windows, cool air is continuously pumped. Up front, the crew are protected by the toughest glass in the world. It's in this visor. It's a transparent, undistorted heat shield which is raised for supersonic flight. The designers found a new, vital and unconventional function for the fuel, helping to control the aircraft's center of gravity in flight. As Concorde accelerates from subsonic to supersonic flight, its aerodynamic center of lift moves aft, from here to here. The effect is to raise the tail and put the aircraft into a nose-down attitude. So, to avoid using conventional subsonic trim devices, like a moving tailplane, and causing unwanted drag in supersonic flight, the fuel is put to work. It's really quite simple. Forward of the main tanks here are these 2 front trim tanks. And back under the tail is another trim tank, which is kept only half full. What happens is this. During transonic acceleration to supersonic flight, fuel is pumped from these front tanks. Some back into the main tanks in the wing, here. Some into the rear tank. At the end of the supersonic cruise, the reverse happens. But of course, the fuel's primary job in life is to feed Concorde's 4 Olympus engines, each capable of producing 38,000 pounds of thrust. That's around twice the power of a 707. Now, one of the paradoxes of these huge engines is that they must be supplied with a subsonic airflow in supersonic flight. And to make this possible, an ingenious variable geometry air intake system is used. It starts here, and the key to the process is ramp doors. The doors create a diversion which sets up a pattern of shock waves. The shock waves reduce the speed of the intake main airflow dramatically. At Mach 2, they slow it down in the space of 11 feet from 1,350 miles an hour in a 4-fold deceleration to 350 miles an hour. Thus, the air arrives at the engine face at half the speed of sound, for which the engines are designed. And it all happens automatically, controlled throughout the speed range by computers. Unique in civil airliners is the reheat or afterburner system, in which extra fuel is burnt to give a boost in thrust for takeoff, and to ease Concorde through Mach 1. Please. Thank you. Perhaps one of the great tributes to those who built Concorde is the way in which they've succeeded in making supersonic flight so comfortable, so normal. The sensation of flight isn't dramatically different from the subsonic experience, even though you're cruising soon after takeoff at just below the speed of sound. Well, today, on this transatlantic flight out of London, I'm being specially privileged. I've been invited onto the flight deck to watch us go supersonic. Concorde is flown by a 3-man crew. Captain on the left, co-pilot on the right, and behind him, at the systems management panel, the flight engineer. Our commander today is Captain Brian Calvert.
Well, we're 15 minutes out of London now. We're still over the land, so we're still flying subsonically, but still also a good deal faster than any conventional aircraft. We're at 28,000 feet at Mach 0.95, and we're clipping along over southwest England at 650 miles an hour. We're on autopilot at the moment, and we shall stay on autopilot except for the landing, which today I'm going to do myself. This autopilot holds very accurately a number of parameters. And at the moment we're particularly automated because it's following the track described by our inertial navigation systems. What we do before we start is type in the latitudes and longitudes of all the turning points, we call them waypoints, on our route. And then as we approach each one of them, the airplane will automatically begin to turn and lead its way onto the new track.
Our next waypoint is our acceleration point, which is just clear of the coast of South Wales. From the inertial digital display, you can see that we've only got 10 miles to run before we start the transonic phase of the flight.
Transonic checklist, please.
Transonic checklist. Engine anti-icing is off. Wing and intake anti-icing is off. Auxiliary inlets are shut. Secondary nozzles are less than 15 degrees. The transonic checklist is complete up to reheat, sir. Now the next thing we have to do is to move fuel from the front of the aeroplane to the rear and centre in order to move the C of G aft. And that's what I'm going to do now. Now, as you can see, the fuel in the front tank is going down and the rear tank is now going up. And in all, I've got to move something like 6,000 gallons of fuel in order to get the centre of gravity in the correct position.
At this point, we're keeping our eye on the centre of gravity indicator. It tells us that the redistribution of the fuel is keeping our balance right. In fact, it's starting to move back at the moment. Now I'm opening up the throttles again to full thrust, and to overcome the drag, I'm going to light up the reheats in pairs. Inboard reheats, outboard reheats. You probably felt the slight kick as the reheats came in. That's because they increased the thrust by 20%. And the aircraft is now increasing its speed and starting to climb so that we shall pass through Mach 1 at 29,000 feet. The speed's building. You can see there's no twitching, no buffeting. In fact, it's all very smooth. The only indication we have is here on the Mach meter, which is reading 0.98 now, 0.99, Mach 1, Mach 1.01. There we are, we're supersonic. The south coast of Ireland is out to starboard of us now. It's about 40 miles away, but on a clear day you can see the whole of southern Ireland stretched out in front of you like a map. It's about 10 minutes now since we lit up the reheats, and we're coming up to Mach 1.7 through the worst effects of the drag, so we'll switch the reheats off again in pairs. Inboard reheats off, outboard reheats off.
It shouldn't be long now before we reach our cruise speed of Mach 2 or just a little above. We're creeping up now, 1.99. It's not as quick as the thrust through Mach 1. Mach 2, twice the speed of sound, and at just 500 miles and 45 minutes out of London. As we go up, you'll notice that we're getting the beginnings of an astronaut's view of things. The sky is assuming the dark blue of outer space, and below we can even make out the curvature of the Earth. We've got a 350-mile line of sight to the horizon, which gives us a 700-mile panorama, which is even greater when there are land or mountains beyond.
If we look at our inertial display now, we can see that our speed over the ground, or over the water in today's case, with a light headwind is 1,140 knots. That's 1,315 miles per hour, or 1 mile every 2 3/4 seconds. And that's what Concorde was built for.
Human flight must rank as one of the resounding achievements of this century. It has happened in the span of a single lifetime, between 1903 and the 1970s. From Orville Wright's faltering excursion into the air, from the Kitty Hawk Flyer to the supreme achievement, Concorde.
Speedbird Concorde 171, Sierra Mike 20 West at 1214, flight level 512. Estimate Sierra Mike 30 West at 1234. Temperature -52 degrees Charlie. Wind 250, diagonal 20 knots. Speedbird 171, Shamwick. Check position, Sierra Mike 20 West at 1214. Flight level 512. Estimating Sierra Mike 30 West at 1234. Temperature -52.